Welcome to the University Research Center podcast for January 2026. I'm Corey Miller, State Economist from Mississippi and Director of the University Research Center. This month's podcast discusses the latest economic outlook for the U.S. and Mississippi economies. Let's get started. Mississippi is one of a number of states expected to experience slower growth in 2026. One of the main reasons is continued uncertainty in U.S. trade policy. This particularly affects the manufacturing sector, which has an outsized presence in the Mississippi economy. Another factor is reduced immigration as a result of changes in policy. This includes both net domestic and net international migration. Employment growth is expected to slow markedly both in Mississippi and in the U.S. in 2026. This is because firms are reluctant to cut back workers, but at the same time they're also reluctant to hire new workers, again going back to the level of uncertainty in the economy. So the end result is that firms are largely expected to maintain their employment levels in 2026. Looking at the latest changes in real gross domestic product on an annual basis, the Bureau of Economic Analysis recently revised up real gross domestic product data for Mississippi, showing a 3.3% increase in 2024 and a 3.2% increase in 2023. These 2 years mark the first time the state had experienced annual growth of more than 3% in real GDP in consecutive years since 1995 and 1996. Growth actually exceeded U.S. growth in both 2023 and 2024. Comparing Mississippi's real GDP growth in 2023 to other states finds that 3.2% expansion ranked 23rd among all states. The largest increase occurred in New Mexico, where real GDP expanded 9.4%. The only state where real GDP contracted in 2023 was Iowa, where real GDP contracted by 0.6%. Comparing real GDP in Mississippi in 2024 to other states finds that 3.3% expansion was tied for 11th with several other states. The largest expansion occurred in the state of Washington, where real GDP expanded 4.7%. The only state where real GDP contracted in 2024 was Wyoming, where real GDP contracted by 0.2%. Looking at the annual change in personal income in Mississippi, personal income increased 4.9% in 2024, which was somewhat less than the U.S. growth of 5.6%. This growth is also down from 2023, when growth was 5.7% in the state. However, both these years tend to exceed the levels of personal income growth that were experienced prior to the pandemic in 2020. Looking at the annual changes in payroll employment in Mississippi, payroll employment grew 0.7% in 2024. This was about half the rate of U.S. increase in payroll employment of 1.3%. This rate was down from 2023, when the state's payroll employment increased by 1.3%, and it was the smallest increase since 2020. Most sectors of the Mississippi economy have recovered the jobs lost in 2020. As of November 2025, the state has added 45,600 jobs since February 2020, an increase of 3.9%. Most of these jobs were added in 3 sectors, with the largest number of jobs added in the trade, transportation, and utility sector of 18,400. The healthcare and social assistance sector was next, adding 11,100 jobs, and the professional and business services sector was third, adding 10,300 jobs. A few sectors have yet to recover all the jobs lost in 2020, including government, which lost 3,900 jobs, other services, which was down by only 400 jobs, the information sector, which is down by 1,100 jobs, and the mining and logging sector, which was down by 900 jobs. The manufacturing sector was down by 5,200 jobs as of November compared to February 2020. However, this sector had actually recovered all the jobs lost in 2020 already, but after increases in interest rates and changes in trade policy, has lost more jobs in the months since. If we compare Mississippi's payroll employment growth since February 2020 to other states, The 3.9% increase is right in the middle and ranks 24th. The largest increase in payroll employment occurred in Idaho, which is up 14.4% since February 2020. At least 3 states have yet to recover the jobs lost in 2020, including Vermont, Massachusetts, and Hawaii. The other major employment survey conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the Residence Employment Survey, which surveys individuals who live in the state. This survey is used to measure the unemployment rate among other factors. As of November 2025, unemployment in Mississippi is down by about 1/3 compared to where it was in February 2020. Employment, however, is only up by about 2.7%. Overall, the labor force has only increased about 0.7% since February 2020. The state's civilian non-institutional population is up 1.4% as of November compared to February 2020. Comparing the change in residence employment in Mississippi to other states since February 2020 finds that the state's 2.7% increase was again near the middle, ranking 26th. The largest increase in residence employment among all states since February 2020 was the 12.7% increase in Texas. Several states have yet to recover all of the residence employment jobs lost in 2020, including West Virginia, New Hampshire, Wyoming, Hawaii, Vermont, and Maryland. Looking at the most recent job openings numbers in the United States as of November 2025, we find just over 7.1 million job openings, a level that is roughly the same as it was at the beginning of 2020. However, when we compare this to the number of hires, we find a number of 5.1 million, which is down somewhat from where we were in the first part of 2020. Looking at the number of job openings in the United States as of November compared to the number of unemployed, we find that the 7.1 million job openings is actually less than the number of unemployed, which reached 7.8 million in November. In fact, this is the first month since about March of 2021 that the number of unemployed in the United States exceeded the number of job openings, which marks an important development in the country's labor market. Looking at the number of job openings in Mississippi as of October, we reached a level of 69,000, which is still elevated compared to early 2020. In fact, October marked the second consecutive month the number of job openings in the state increased. The number of hires in the state, however, in October was only 42,000, which is somewhat below where it was in early 2020. The ratio of job openings to hires in the state in October was about 1.6, which is considerably above the level in early 2020 of about 1.0. Comparing the number of job openings to the number of unemployed in Mississippi finds that as of November, almost 49,000 individuals were unemployed, a number that is well below its early 2019 and early 2020 levels. This compares to the number of job openings as of October, which was 69,000, a number that is still elevated from early 2019 when the level was about 53,000. Importantly, the ratio of job openings to unemployed ratio was about 1.2 in 2025, which compares to ratios of about 0.8 in 2019 and 0.7 in 2020. Looking at the labor force participation rate in Mississippi and the United States, as of November, the rate in Mississippi was 55.6%. This rate is about where it was in early 2022. The rate has fallen since May of this year when it reached 56.2%, very close to the pre-pandemic level of 56.4%. The U.S. labor force participation rate in November was 62.4%, a similar level that the rate has been for approximately the past 2 years. The number of seasonally adjusted initial unemployment claims in Mississippi as of December was just over 5,000. The first time this number has reached the 5,000 level since March of 2025. However, this level is still below the average 2019 level, which was about 5,375 unemployment claims per month. And most importantly, the average in 2025 was below the average in 2024 and well below the average in 2019, which indicates the state has not, as of yet, seen a large number of layoffs. The number of continued unemployment claims in Mississippi in December was a seasonally adjusted 31,500. This number is well below the 2019 monthly average of about 38,000 claims per month. Notably, however, the trend over the past several months has been an increasing number of continued unemployment claims per month. This is an indication that individuals who have lost a job are taking longer to find a new job. The commitment rate on the conventional 30-year mortgage as of the third quarter of 2025 was about 6.5%. This level is expected to continue to slowly decrease over the next several months, finally falling below 6% in about the third quarter of 2026. An important economic indicator in Mississippi is building permits, and although many areas of the state do not require building permits, they still give us information about the economy. If we look back to early 2022, when interest rates began to increase, we saw a decrease in building permits in the state, and that number has somewhat recovered and been fairly stable for about the past 2 years. Another important economic indicator in Mississippi is the level of income tax withholdings in the state. For the calendar year just concluded, we saw that on a nominal basis, income tax withholdings in the state decreased 1.1% in 2025. On an inflation-adjusted basis, income tax withholdings in the state decreased 3.4%. We also saw a decrease in 2024 on an inflation-adjusted basis of 1.5%, but an actual 1.3% increase on a nominal basis. The value of these numbers is somewhat diminished, though, because of ongoing income tax cuts in the state, which are decreasing the amount of withholdings collected. Looking at the Mississippi Leading Index of Economic Indicators, for most of 2025, this index trended down, although we did see a brief spike in the middle of the year. The most recently completed month with available data was October, when we saw a reading of 100.8 for the Mississippi Leading Index. This shows that the leading index is down about 5% since the beginning of 2025. Looking at the Consumer Price Index, we find that as of December, the monthly 12-month change was 2.7%. This level is very consistent with what we saw throughout most of 2025. And really going into 2024, we've seen the year-over-year change in the CPI range from about 2.5 to 3%. This range is still elevated compared to the Federal Reserve's target of annual inflation of 2%. Looking at the core consumer price index, which excludes the more volatile categories of food and energy, as of December, the monthly 12-month change in the core CPI was 2.6%. While still elevated, we have seen a more consistent decrease in the core CPI over the past year to 2 years. A deeper dive into inflation considers the 12-month change in the consumer price index for specific categories of goods as of December 2025. The 12-month change in the CPI for energy in December was 2.3%. This includes a year-over-year change in gasoline of negative 3.4%. However, the 12-month change in the consumer price index for food in December was 3.1%, again somewhat elevated. The change in the consumer price index for new vehicles was very small in December, only 0.3%. One of the biggest contributors to the overall level of inflation is the cost of shelter or owner-occupied housing, which in December was still 3.2%. However, the CPI for shelter has come down over the past several months. Another measure related to inflation is the Employment Cost Index produced by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This index is another measure of employer labor cost. Most economists believe the 12-month change in the Employment Cost Index of 3% is consistent with the Federal Reserve's annual target of inflation of 2%. However, as of the third quarter of 2025, the 12-month change in the Employment Cost Index for wages and salaries for all private workers in the U.S. was 3.6%. And in fact, the third quarter marked the second consecutive quarter this Employment Cost Index increased. So it's likely another explanation why we see somewhat elevated inflation. Another reason we see elevated inflation likely has to do with the share of consumer expenditures that are spent on goods compared to services. Prior to the pandemic in 2019, about 32% of consumption expenditures were devoted to goods. That number increased to as high as 37% during the pandemic and has come down, but is still elevated compared to prior to the pandemic. As of September 2025, this share was 34%, still about 2 percentage points above the pre-pandemic level, and likely explains one reason we continue to see inflation above the Federal Reserve's target. Turning to monetary policy, the firm S&P Global Market Intelligence projects that the Federal Reserve will next cut the federal funds rate target by 25 basis points in June of this year. They expect that will be followed by another 25 basis point cut in September of this year. However, both of these anticipated reductions in the target rate will be highly data dependent. After September, the target rate will reach what the firm believes is the long-run neutral range, which neither stimulates nor restricts economic activity in the U.S. of 3 to 3.25% in the fourth quarter of this year. Turning to economic forecasts, the firm S&P Global Market Intelligence continues to make a number of assumptions regarding tariffs in its latest forecast. These include the Section 232 tariffs of 10 to 25% on copper, lumber, pharmaceuticals, and critical minerals in the fourth quarter of 2025. These also include 50% tariffs on aluminum and steel. The assumptions also include IEEPA tariffs on China of 10%, Canada of 35%, and Mexico of 25%. These are tariffs imposed based on the fentanyl emergency. The tariffs on Canada and Mexico are projected to fall to 15% by the middle of 2026. Finally, the tariff assumptions include the universal or so-called reciprocal tariffs that range from 10 to 40%. S&P Global Market Intelligence assumes an overall effective tariff rate imposed by the U.S. of 16%. The latest baseline forecast by the firm S&P Global Market Intelligence finds that the firm projects U.S. real gross domestic product increase 2.2% in 2025, which would mark a notable decrease from the 2.8% growth experienced in 2024. Similar growth is expected in 2026 of 2.3%, followed by slightly less growth of under 2% at 1.9% in 2027. The University Research Center currently projects that Mississippi's real gross domestic product increased 1.8% in 2025, which would mark a considerable decrease from 2024 when real GDP in the state expanded 3.3%. Similar growth is expected in 2026 of 1.5%, followed by a decrease in growth to 1.1% in 2027. The firm S&P Global Market Intelligence believes U.S. payroll employment growth was 0.9% in 2025, a decrease from the 1.3% growth that occurred in 2024. Growth in 2026 is expected to slow markedly, increasing only 0.5%, and again in 2027, growth is only expected to be 0.5%. University Research Center currently projects Mississippi payroll employment increased 1% in 2025, a slight increase from the 0.7% increase in payroll employment in 2024. However, like the U.S. job market, the University Research Center projects very small growth in 2026, as payroll employment is expected to increase only 0.3%. And then in 2027, job growth is expected to be relatively flat in the state, increasing only 0.1%. Looking at the forecast of inflation by the firm S&P Global Market Intelligence, inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index is expected to increase 2.5% in 2026, a number that is very similar to the rate of 2025 when inflation increased 2.6%. As tariffs continue to work through the economy, the firm expects a slight increase in inflation on an annual basis in 2027 to 2.8%. To summarize the economic outlook, the U.S. economy is expected to grow an average of 2% annually in terms of real gross domestic product through the end of this decade. The labor market, more significantly, however, is expected to grow well below trend through the end of the decade. There is currently no recession in the national forecast, and the risk of a recession occurring in the next 12 months is likely in the range of 25 to 30%. Inflation, as we've noted, is expected to remain above target through at least 2027. That concludes the January 2026 URC podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to our publications and follow us on X or Twitter at Mississippi URC. Thanks for watching.